Now, I've owned the Sigma 135mm f1.8 for some time now. In fact, it was one of the very first lenses that I purchased for my Sony A7 Mark III when I made the switch from Canon to Sony. I do really love the 135mm focal length. It's a great choice for portrait photographers, particularly if you're like me and you shoot events and weddings on the side, as not only is it a great lens for headshots and full-length portraits, but it's also really useful for getting natural candid shots of people from a distance whilst remaining inconspicuous. When it comes to picking a 135mm lens for your mirrorless Sony camera, there's really not a lot of choice. In fact, at the time of making this video, there are only really two options you can choose from. And that's the Sigma 135mm f1.8 DG HSM Art lens and the Sony FE 135mm f1.8 G Master. I mean, yes, all right, technically there is a Zeiss Batis 135mm f2.8 you can buy, but for me, f2.8 just really isn't fast enough for a prime. And there's also a Samyang 135mm f2, but that's manual focus only, so screw that. Going back to the time when I was first searching for a 135mm lens for my Sony camera, I went for the Sigma option, primarily because of the price difference, which we'll come on to later. But since then, I've seen a lot of people online suggesting that actually the Sony 135mm might be the slightly better option and is the one to go for, despite this bigger price tag. So this week I thought I would put any speculation to rest and test these two lenses head to head to find out which of these lenses is the best 135mm option for Sony mirrorless cameras. Okay, this week I've decided there's no messing about. We have a lot to cover. We're gonna get straight into the specs. I'm not gonna mention that I've had my hair cut finally, but I know you noticed. Okay, let's start with the cheapest option first, which is the Sigma lens. At the time of testing on Amazon, this lens is priced at £1,099 or $1,392 and weighs in at a hefty 1,230 grams, which is approximately 43.4 ounces. But for a lens that offers a maximum aperture of 1.8 with a focal length of 135mm, this heavier weight is somewhat to be expected. The lens body is well made and constructed from the usual mix of hard plastics, metal and rubber that is typical of most Sigma lenses these days. It is also worth noting that this lens was originally designed for DSLRs and then it was retrofitted with a modification at the bottom in order for it to fit onto mirrorless cameras. And as a result, this makes the lens slightly longer than the Sony. On the lens body, there's a focus distance window as well as a focus limiter switch and an MF to AF switch. On the bottom, there's a solid brass lens mount and also some weather sealing to prevent moisture and dust from entering the camera body whilst you have this lens attached. When mounted to the front of my Sony A7 Mark III, it is noticeably front heavy, and having used this lens for the past few years, I can tell you now that if you are prone to back problems like I am, using this lens for lengthy periods of time is gonna cause you some issues. For quick portrait shoots, then this is not so much of an issue, but I've lugged this thing around all day with me at a wedding before, and it's just murder, I promise you. God, I sound old. Moving over to the Sony now, the good news is that this lens is slightly lighter than the Sigma, weighing in at 950 grams or 33.6 ounces. As this lens was designed specifically for Sony mirrorless cameras, it's also slightly shorter than the Sigma, and as a result it feels quite nice in the hand to hold when mounted to my Sony A7 Mark III. The bad news, however, is that this thing is pricey. On Amazon today you can pick this lens up for £1,589 or $2,098, making it roughly £500 or $700 more expensive than the Sigma. So what do you get for this extra money? Well, the body itself is made from a similar combination of metal, hard plastic and rubber like the Sigma. However, on the lens body, you do get a lot more in terms of features. Firstly, there's a manual aperture ring that clicks nicely at each third of a stop. For videographers, there's a D-click switch, which once activated allows for a smooth transition through the aperture range, which can be quite a useful feature for adjusting the exposure on the fly. Turning this dial to automatic mode, noted by a little A on the lens body, will allow this lens to function more like a standard lens, where you can just adjust the aperture value using the back of your camera instead. However, there is no lock switch for this aperture ring, so you aren't able to fix this into auto mode and just forget about it if you're like me and and really have no use for this feature. Now, some people aren't put off by this, but the downside of not having a locked switch is that it is possible for the aperture ring to get knocked whilst in your bag or whilst you're carrying it on a camera strap by your side, which will cause the aperture value to jump to some random value, which can get slightly annoying if this isn't something you're used to checking before you start shooting. On the opposite side of the lens to this D-click switch, there are two more switches. The first is a focus limiter switch, and the second is an MF to AF switch. This lens also has two focus hold buttons which can be customized to function as shortcuts to a whole bunch of camera options, which is really nice. And finally, just like the Sigma, the Sony's lens mount is made from solid metal, and there's also some weather sealing present. So now we know what these lenses are made of, let's go over to the lens chart to see how these handle in terms of image quality. Starting with the Sigma, and there's a small amount of pincushion distortion at the edges of the frame, with some dark corners due to the effects of vignetting when shooting wide open at f1.8. However, after enabling the lens correction profile in Lightroom, you can see that these issues pretty much disappear. Zooming into the center, and you can see that this lens is nice and sharp with only a very, very small hint of purple fringing present. At the corners of the frame, this lens does soften slightly and there's still a touch of purple fringing, but overall, this is a very well-performing lens. Now it's the Sony's turn. Just like the Sigma, this lens has a touch of pincushion distortion and some darker edges, but again, with the lens correction profile enabled in Lightroom, these issues have disappeared. At the center, this lens is identical in terms of sharpness compared to the Sigma, but unlike the Sigma, there is absolutely no signs of chromatic aberration, which is a slight improvement. At the corners, this lens is still really sharp and there's still no real evidence of fringing, so this is a slightly better performance overall compared to the Sigma. At the moment, these lenses are pretty much neck and neck in terms of image quality, with the Sony just inching ahead due to it being slightly sharper at the corners and also not having any chromatic aberration at the center. As always, in order to really test out what these lenses are capable of, I headed out into the woods with my friend Sophie for the day with both of these lenses in my camera bag to see how they performed in real life situations. During the shoot, I genuinely had to keep checking the front of my camera to remind myself which lens I was using, as these lenses performed almost identically. Other than the Sigma being slightly more front heavy, both lenses handled extremely well and were really a joy to use. The 135mm focal length is so good for single portraits, especially when shooting full length portraits, as the longer focal length not only eliminates any distortion, but it also creates a lovely amount of separation between the subject and the background when shooting wide open. You do obviously have to shoot at quite a distance from your subject in order to do this, but if you're outside and there's plenty of room, then this really isn't a problem. Comparing the results from these lenses side by side, it's almost impossible to tell which is which. Go ahead, try for yourself. If you can identify which of these images was shot by the Sigma and which was shot by the Sony, be sure to let me know in the comments below. In terms of bokeh, when shooting wide open at f1.8, both lenses created lovely smooth defocused areas in the background, which really helped to draw the focus onto my subject. In our bokeh balls test, more nearly identical results here, with the balls starting off more round in the center of the frame, ending up in a cat's eye shape once they neared the edges of the frame. Turning our attention to autofocus for a moment, I am happy to say that both IAF and face detection worked flawlessly with both of these lenses, which is really good news, because when you're shooting portraits at f1.8, especially when you're really close up with a lens as long as this, you're going to need all the help you can get. Turning off the IAF for a second and testing out the focusing speeds of these lenses, both performed extremely well, locking on between near and far subjects without any signs of hunting. If I was going to be super picky, I would have to say that the Sony was the faster of the two lenses, but we are talking fractions of a second here, and the Sigma was by no means a slow lens. At the end of the shoot, the sun had set and it was getting pretty dark in the woods, so we tested out the AF again in these low light conditions. Once again, both lenses put in a really solid performance with no signs of hunting from either lens. Again, the Sony was marginally faster compared to the Sigma, but not enough to totally rule out the Sigma as a viable option. Switching over to video mode and with face detect enabled, the Sigma would lock on initially to Sophie's face at a distance, but then as she started walking towards the camera, it would for some reason lose focus until she got a bit closer to the camera. Once the focus had locked on though, it did manage to stay locked on until the very end, but hardly a perfect performance. This performance was almost identical when Sophie was moving towards the camera at a faster pace too. The Sony lens was thankfully a different story and was able to keep locked onto Sophie's face throughout the entire walk. This was the same result when she was moving at a faster pace too. As for AF noise, the Sony is by far the quieter of the two. I literally have to put my ear up against this lens in order to hear any noise. The Sigma is also very quiet. In most scenarios, you would not hear the AF motor moving, but the Sony is clearly the quieter of the two and the option to go for if you need a lens that just doesn't make a peep. So with all of the testing complete, I need to decide a winner now. Which of these lenses is the ultimate 135mm lens for Sony mirrorless cameras? That is the question. To help me with this, I'm going to go through each of the categories we've tested and award a point to the winner in each round, and the lens with the most points at the end is surely going to be our winner. Starting with price, and obviously the Sigma is the winner here. It's significantly cheaper than the Sony, so it has to get the point in this round. When it comes to build quality, I think the point has to go to both of these lenses as they're both really well built, so it's only fair that this round is a draw. In terms of handling, I'm actually going to give the point to the Sony lens in this round, mainly because it's lighter in weight, so it's not going to destroy your back quite as quickly as the Sigma does, but also because of the features on this lens, most notably the two customizable buttons. I can see them coming in really handy whilst out at shoot, compared to what the Sigma offers, which is kind of not a lot. So the point goes to Sony in this round. The next two rounds are image quality and bokeh, and as we've seen from our test images, these lenses are pretty much identical. Now, if you're really being picky, you could argue that the Sony is marginally better because it offers slightly sharper edges when we're shooting wide open, and it doesn't have any fringing at all in the center, whilst the Sigma did have a tiny touch of that purple fringing. But honestly, I feel like it would be a huge disservice to the Sigma if it didn't get a point in this round, so a point each for both image quality and bokeh. This just leaves AF performance, and I think in this round, Sony is the winner. It's marginally faster when taking stills. That's probably not enough in itself to make it the winner, but where it really dominates is when shooting in video mode. The Sigma, unfortunately, just isn't quite up to it when using autofocus at a distance, whereas the Sony just didn't show any issues at all, so a well-deserved point to the Sony in this round. And at the end of scoring, you can see that the Sony has just about clinched this one, making it the better of the two lenses after testing. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the whole reason why I wanted to test these two lenses together was to find out whether I'd actually made the right decision opting for the Sigma over the Sony in the first place. So the question is, do I regret buying the Sigma? No. Absolutely not. I think this test has shown, if anything, that despite the Sony being the slightly better lens in terms of AF, actually the Sigma is a really good lens and it's great value for money. The Sony is no doubt an awesome piece of kit, but for me personally, I don't think the small advantages it offers justifies me spending an extra £500 on it, especially as I don't tend to use 135mm lenses all that much, mainly because they're really heavy and apparently these days my spine is completely made of butter. That said, if you're a photographer or videographer or both that's looking for a reliable 135mm lens that delivers consistently across the board, then no doubt the Sony is the one to pick. As a final thought, personally, I've still got my fingers crossed that Sigma will release a proper 135mm DG-DN version of this lens, one that has been specifically designed for mirrorless cameras rather than this rehashed DSLR hand-me-down one that we have to deal with at the moment. Hopefully it's lighter weight, smaller, and also offers the same, if not better, image quality than either of these 135mm that we've got to choose from now. If they can do that, I can promise you now, I will be the first in line to buy a copy of that lens. Anyway guys, that about wraps it up for this test. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I release videos just like this every single Friday, and I look forward to seeing your beautiful little face in the next one. That's the one. Nailed it. Got it.
I'm gonna regret that now.